All right, good morning. So excited that you could join us for our webinar discussion today on repatriation. We're going to start with lamp lighting. So this is a soapstone lamp. My colleague Ayu made this lamp in a class with her relative Kunak, and it was carved out of soapstone in the style of her ancestors. She's from Alutiiq. And we have it filled with oil, and this wick is a cotton grass wick that's just wetted with the oil. I'm from Kodiak, and our ancestors also used oil lamps like Ayu's ancestors. And we today are using oil lamps for ceremony. And when I light my oil lamp, I invite my ancestors and all of your ancestors into the room so that they can be honored as we have this discussion today and be present with us to remind us about what's important, and also to inspire us to see what we need to see and learn what we need to learn today. So I'll light the lamp. And I'll pass it off to Sdaahl for our prayer.
I just wanted to share prayer today as we gather and we have our ancestors around us. Anabaset Denahato for bringing us to this time, to this space where we can bring light to something that could be painful and bring about energies, and we just ask for our ancestors and Denahato to protect us and help us bring through healing that we need to see in this world today. Anabaset. Amen.
Baset, Sara, and Chinen, Chutman, thank you so much. I believe we are going to bring Dixie over to share a few words before we dive in. Good morning, Dixie. Sangait la uslang.
Good morning. That was beautiful. Thank you so much for starting us today with the lighting of the lamp and then the prayer. I know that today we're going to be talking about some very painful topics and things that I know museums have a lot to learn about. I'd like to welcome everyone today. This is our 5th webinar in the series. If you're interested in seeing the previous webinars, they will be posted on First Alaskans Institute's YouTube page in the future. I believe they're still being edited, and we will let everyone know when those are available. My name is Dixie Clough. I'm the director of Museums Alaska, which is a statewide museum association here in Alaska. I began my position last April, so I haven't been here very long. And when I moved to the state, which was last May, I moved here from Florida, but I grew up mostly in Maryland, right outside of DC. So Alaska is very new to me. And when I started this position, I wanted to get a feel for what museums might need from us as an association. So I spoke to several board members and to colleagues across Alaska, and I heard many times that fostering meaningful relationships with Alaska Natives and their tribes was something a lot of museums wanted to do, or maybe had started, but didn't know how to build on the relationships they already had. So we were interested in creating a program that would help build these relationships and to keep them going into the future. But we also knew that we couldn't do it alone. I've said this at every webinar. I'm going to say it again. I personally am a white woman and I moved to Alaska last year. I am not the person to lead these conversations. And most of my board is in the same boat. The museum world is, of course, very much a middle-class white woman-run industry still. It's something that we'd love to change, but right now, it just means that there are some conversations that we need to reach out to people who have had the proper experiences to learn from. I can speak to museum practice, but I can't speak to the experiences that Alaska Native visitors have had when they visit our museums, or the experiences Alaska Native individuals and tribes have had when they work with our museums, or they, even at our museums. But I knew in Alaska, there was an organization that could really help us bridge that gap in knowledge. And at the top of our list was, we wanted to partner with First Alaskans Institute. And right when we were planning to reach out, the Alaska State Library received some ARPA funds, COVID relief funds from IMLS, which is the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And they were kind enough to share them with the museum worlds. And we knew that this grant opportunity was an opportunity for us to partner with First Alaskans and create this program together. And we reached out to them, and it was very last minute, and they were so kind and so willing to jump in, and they were up for this challenge. And they have been amazing. We've worked on this since last year, and I've been so impressed with all the thoughtfulness of all the program's details. And I know that I have learned so much. The cohort that we're working with, in addition to these webinars, have learned so much. And I've heard from many webinar viewers that they have also learned a lot. So thank you so much to First Alaskans. This has been an amazing program. I'm looking forward to today. I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers, and I'm looking forward to next week as well. So if you are joining us today, please do join us again next week. And I'm going to go ahead and let the speakers take over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dixie. Welcome, everyone. It's going to be a great day with everybody, and I'm so thankful that we have these honored guests with us who have dedicated a large portion of their morning to join us. And I'm thankful for the now 36 participants who are watching and witnessing. And as Dixie said, all of this will be recorded and will be available after the fact if folks want to go back and watch again, or if maybe your colleagues didn't get a chance to watch this and wanted the opportunity and you just want to share it because it's such great information and our people shared with their heart like they always do. And so again, this will be recorded and edited and then available online later after the fact. So welcome, everyone. My name is Wafal Gidak. My English name is Barbara Blake. I am Xaadas, Rian from the Shark House. My family is from Hiktahunglai and Haida Gwaii. My grandfather's people are Tleanedi, the Dog Salmon people. They come from Tlawac. My father's people are Otna Athabaskan. The Nelchina, the Sky Clan, are my father's people, and they come from Chestachina. Calling in today from Zantakahini, otherwise known as Juneau, homeland of the Akwán and the greater Juneau Douglas area, the Takakwán as well. Thankful to be participating today, and I will be one of your co-hosts this morning. And I will pass it over to Laganai to introduce herself.
Sangait La Uthlang, everyone, the day is getting good. I'm so excited for the time we get to share this morning with our guests. My name is Lagunai, and I have the honor of being able to be here today through this work that we do at First Alaskans Institute. But I do want to introduce myself fully. Nunquaga Gitkianan Sinadinan Kiagan. Nunquaga Gitkianans was my grandmother, Mona Jackson. She was from Haida Gwaii, Hiktahunglai, and made her home here in Qiqquan. Ganahake Kennedy Chan Kiagan. Ganahake was my grandfather, Tommy Jackson Sr. Hatlangadasi was Lingít. He was also Tsagwedi, the Killer Whale people, and that makes me the grandchild of the Kilauea people in our Lingít way, Zagwedi Dutch Khan Ayahat. Dela Slath Kawasinudi Aukiong. Dela Chini is my mother. She's a teacher, a weaver, and you'll recognize that her name is the same name as one of our guests with us today, Slath Kawas. So I'm so glad to be in the presence of my awa. Bill Chini Hinudi Kiagan. I'm still trying to get used to it. I get tripped up saying my father in the past tense. He's now one of my ancestors. He made his home here in Cake, and he moved on just after Thanksgiving this year. So I'm still adjusting my way of speaking about him. So Chish for bearing with me. Lagunai Hinodi Khadkil Dikiang. Lagunai is my Haida name. And Gatsakas Gustidi Kwalag, and I'm Eagle. Chichgitne Udi Ijong. I'm a Chichgitne woman. Our crest is the hummingbird. We have other crests as well, but that's the one that I usually share. And this series is so critically important. Even in Watlak Gidak's introduction and in my introduction, the way that we speak about our ancestors and the way that we introduce ourselves, it's both a matter of respect to the people who we are with. It's our way of showing deep respect to the people that we are sharing time with. A lot of folks may not necessarily understand that that's what's happening, but as Native people, it's always been something that we've been taught. Because we're bringing our ancestors in with us and introducing them as well. It's with a lot of love for our people, and that means a lot when you share it with a group. And a lot of folks may not have ever really been told or described why Native people introduce themselves the way that we do. We all come from different backgrounds. We all come from diverse Native people. And yet this is something that I have noticed is in common between so many of us, is the acknowledgement of bringing our ancestors in out of respect for the people we're with, but out of also love for our ancestors and their knowledge and our ability to be here. So grateful for your presence, to our speakers, for being with us. And I'll hand it over to Chutman to introduce herself.
Mai hui Candace Branson up the Hatanga Chutman, Shunamisutlanga et Dahaloa, Anaka Martha Branson, Adaka Steve, Amaka Edna Ferris, Apdaki Tutsi, Apaka Phil, Amasina Luka Martha Shravloff, Apasina Luka Nick Shravloff Sr. My family is from Kodiak, we're Sukhberg, and I was born there and work there, though I'm calling in from Anchorage today, from the FAI offices. And I'm really looking forward to listening in on this conversation. I know that I've gotten to participate in the previous webinars and just getting to soak up all the gems, the wisdom of our guest speakers, and the life experiences, the storytelling. It's been really powerful. So I'm really glad to be able to participate in this today. I'll pass it over to Sdaahl.
Zan Hazoon, it's a good day. I am Angela Gonzalez. Danaka Heste Slada Dathna Seasni. I'm Koikan Athabaskan and my Danaka name is Slada Dathna. Huslia Hutsen Tsedanslet. Huslia is Tsate Dekanten is where I'm from on the Kaikuk River. And Anchorage, Lesto, I'm from Anchorage. And the Danaka name for Anchorage is Heyot Togi Den. And Ita'a Al Yatlin Senior Bauza and Ina'a Eleanor Yatlin Bauza. My parents are Alan Eleanor Yatlin from Huslia. And my grandparents, Sitsia Yes Sitsu, Ita'a Bedethnaka, George Frank, Yes Minnie Yatlin, Yes Alda Frank Havuzaila. And Ina'a Bedethnaka, Edwin Simon and Lydia Simon Havuzaila. Those are my grandparents. I'm so happy to be here today.
And I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We're calling in from Indigenous lands across the state of Alaska, and we want to express gratitude for the stewardship of the Indigenous people who have been rigorously upholding that stewardship since time immemorial. The FAI office, First Alaskans Institute, as well as the Museums Alaska home base are both in Anchorage, which is Dagayakak, which is on Dena'ina land. So Koyana.
If it's okay, I'll just ask Sonia to introduce herself. Sonia Bent has agreed to join us today as a healer. So Anabaset Sonia, and she just has a special message for us as we go on about this topic today.
My name is Sonia Bent. I'm from the same community as Angela, Tahtzik, which is Huslia on the Kaikuk River. If you're in Fairbanks, it's 240 miles northwest of Fairbanks. It's about an hour and 15 minutes by air. So it's very far out there on the Kaikuk River. The water runs down from the Brooks Range and it flows into the Yukon. So that's where I was born and raised. My parents were late Lorna and Freddie Bent. And my grandparents, paternal grandparents were Robert and Mary Bent. Maternal grandparents, Sophie and Tony Sam. Was born and raised out in the woods for about 5 or 6 years until I started school. And so I, like Candace was saying, you know, we have that created a deep respect within me for the land and everything around me. And we carry that. We are the stewards of this land. I firmly believe that. And we continue with our old ways, right? We continue with our old ways and through our dreams and everything that we've carried into this existence that we are at right now. So did you want me to do a meditation right now, or is that later?
If you're more comfortable with of helping with that as we close out, or if you'd like to do that now in preparation before we go into the discussion. I think, you know, one of the reasons that I really value you joining us, Sonia, as a healer is, you know, the discussion topic today is about repatriation and about the treatment of our ancestors. And we wanted to be really supportive and caring about this topic because it comes with so much pain, especially in relationship to our ancestors that are in institutions, and what that experience is like for our people to be able to take care of them, to be able to visit them, to be able to bring them home. And out of sensitivity to the topic and to our ancestors, we wanted to make sure that we had a healing presence with us, that our participants who are joining us over the webinar can reach out to you if they just want to talk to someone. Tlodadathno has on her screen here her contact information. So if any of our webinar participants would like to talk with a healer or just connect with someone, then you can call or text Tlodadathna at the number that you see on the screen, and she'll help make that possible. It is not always an easy subject, right, for people to talk about. And we know we have to talk about some real hard truths around these issues. So grateful for you being here with us.
That's it. Thank you so much for that little overview. So I think to go into this in a good way, I will do a brief meditation so that we go forward without hurting anyone, because whenever we hurt someone, it comes back to us. And it's really important to not create all of that debt, so to speak, because I think when I think of what's going on with the country, I think that's what's happening. We have to be careful with our words, the way we say it, the way we embrace our heritage and everything about us. It's so beautiful and so incredibly amazing that it creates this jealousy sometimes. Even though, and through trauma, it seemed to bring out the diamond from the rough, right? And so we have this beautiful, beautiful diamond, and which is our heritage, and we want that to continue. And we have so much to teach and educate the population, that we need to find that delicate balance of making sure that we don't hurt anyone in the process, that we keep all of mankind in mind as we move forward. This is like a one effort that's moving forward. We're all coming into the flow and going forward. So with that, I would like us to just plant our feet on the ground, on the floor, and close your eyes and just take some nice deep cleansing breath in through your nose and out. And as we do that, just bring about in your mind's eye, your third eye, this beautiful place that you just so love, that brings you peace and solitude, wherever that is. Just bring it into your mind's eye and just continue breathing in. And as we breathe in, just pull up from your root chakra, from the bottoms of your feet. Imagine this energy flowing through the soles of your feet, all the way through your root chakra, this deep red color of energy. Bring it up through your root into your sacral chakra, which is an orange, and into your solar plexus. And just embrace all of that root chakra, which is your heritage, the way you were born and raised, everything that your ancestors brought you. Beautiful chakra. And as you continue to breathe, just imagine this beautiful crystal flow of energy coming down through your crown chakra. And just bring it down through your crown, right at the top of your head where it's called the anterior fontanelle, your, where there was an opening when you were a baby, just draw it down into that chakra. Crystal flow of energy, beautiful Father Sky energy. Just bring it down, all the way down again into your solar plexus. It comes down through your third eye, your intuition, through your throat chakra that helps you with communication, and your corona, your heart chakra, which is a green, beautiful, beautiful green color. Bring it down into your solar plexus and just blend those two crystal clear energy chakra colors with the deep red. Blend them together into this beautiful fuchsia rose color. Just blending the two and create this nice aura around you to provide protection for you and everything that you come in contact with. And as we do this, just extend it out to all of our friends and family, loved ones who are suffering from illness, loss. Extend it out to them. Remember them. Bring them into the fold. And as we do this, also bring in the ancestors. All of those that have gone through loss, bring them in. Bring them in. As we pray for them, they pray for us. It's a strengthening between the veils. And just spread that beautiful love all across the state of Alaska, across the lands for protection. That we're careful with the way that we use our resources, that we bring that in. We pray for the leadership, that they do the right thing without harming the land and all living things on the land, the minerals, the plants. We pray this time for protection for all of that, which we love and are so grateful for, Creator. And then we extend this love all through the country, the US that we live in. We pray for our country. We pray that we become the shining example for the rest of the world. The whole world watches us. We need to be careful how we do this. As we pray for peace throughout our country, and we extend this light all around the planet. We take everyone on the planet into the fold, and even beyond that, the multiverse. We bring all of those living creatures into the fold. We're all working toward the same thing. We all want peace. We want happiness and joy. We want love. We want to demonstrate love and be love. We pray for these things and we're thankful for everything that we have. Anabase.
Anabase, Sonia. Thank you so much for helping us be ready for the discussion and prepare us in such a beautiful way. So, and I just want to reiterate to our participants, if you're at a moment at any time during this webinar, you feel like reaching out to talk with someone, to connect with somebody, because we acknowledge that this is can be a heavy conversation when we talk about taking care of our ancestors and the process of repatriation and what that means to us, what that has been like for us as Native people. It can bring things up. So connect with Tlodo Dathno. The contact information has been shared in the chat as well, and it's also on her screen. So you could reach out to her that way. So Chish, Sonia, so much. We're going to transition now to talking a little bit about what we're doing here today together. And you're already getting a sense of what that is because of the way that we have started. And you know, as Native people, who we are, our ancestral lineage is not something in the past to us. It is something living and present within each of us. And so when we approach talking about these things, we want to make sure that we're centering that love and that connection. It's not necessarily always the case, depending on the systems and the institutions that we're engaging with. And so for our time today, we are centering our Native people, and we are centering who we are and the way that we want to talk about our ancestors, the way that we want to talk about and share about our relationship to them, and then also those connections with these institutions. So while we're being sensitive, we also want to be real, because we care about our ancestors, we care about our communities and our people, we care about the people who are right now holding them in institutions, and know that that relationship can be stronger and can be really amazing. And there are some good examples that already exist, and we know that there will be good examples moving forward, more good examples. So we just want to take that time to acknowledge our process today and what we're going to be talking about with our incredible guests, and why we're centering our ancestral connections for this webinar. Wathla.
I'm super thankful to start things out the way that we have this morning, and appreciative of everybody who's contributed to starting us in a good way. These folks who are going to be our guest speakers this morning are all amazing contributors to our community and to our ancestors and to our connection to our ancestors. And I'm so thankful that they have decided to join us this morning and join us for this time. And we have 3 amazing contributors with us, and we'll ask each of them to introduce themselves this morning. Why don't we start with Bob? Shaagunastaa, if you would introduce yourself.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for making this a safe place. This morning, my hands were kind of sweaty, and my stomach was all tied up in knots, and my knees were shaking. And it's my public speaking preparing me to, my body preparing me to speak in public. My Tlingit name, Shaagunastaa. Shaagunastaa yuchattu asal. Planedi ayachat. Ka guantan yadi. Dachloedi dachkunk. My Tlingit name is Shaagunastaa. It roughly translates to the man with the golden face, the mountain goat who got a human face It also refers to the man who taught human beings how to respect the dead. So it's a name that I was born into from a very young age. And I was raised to respect and honor our ancestors and to clean up our family graves and make sure that they're properly taken care of. I'm a Tlin dog salmon. My family's originally from Juneau, Auk Bay. I am Auk Kwan. My mother's Tlingit name is Nawan Tla, which translates to the mother of Nawan, Mary Kanash. And my grandfather was Pete Kanash from Angoon. And my great-grandfather was Kauai out of Juneau. And so my family is from Juneau, but I was raised here in Sitka. And I was more familiar with my father's people, the Kagwantan. And so my father, his Tlingit name was Kajake. And his grandfather was a guy named Lieutenant George Emmons. And it was Lieutenant George Emmons that brought my father's family together with my mother's family, because Emmons was very close friends with Kauai. So traditionally, even though Emmons was a white guy, he brought our families together, and that's where my brothers and sisters came to be. I've been restoring cemeteries my whole life, and it's work that I really treasure. And I've always protected myself in a way that I could feel comfortable doing this work. So I'm very happy to participate today. Thank you for shedding light on our ancestors, Kanashtish. We're a wonderful people. We have a very beautiful culture, and we have strong people today who are ready for the return of our ancestors. So I'm very happy to do this work with other people, and so that we can work off each other's inner strength. So I'll stop here, and I'm a protector of sacred sites, ancient places, old village sites, sacred ground. I just love to walk in the footprints of my ancestors. I love it. To go to the places where they have gone and make it relevant for today. So, Kanashtish, thank you.
Gunshtish, Shaagunastaa. Thank you for that beautiful image of our ancestors walking in and being able to step in those same footprints. Sdaahl.
Singe lasti tulang stalk as henadikiang dio hadagang dio odagang at iwastu dia skagang Rosabelle di Norwegian Mamie Jones Iscan Lucy Frank di Norwegian SFU School Gagan, Haida Repatriation Committee, Shangulang. My name is Sdaahl, and I come from the Haida Nation. Cheers. And I've been working in repatriation for going on 30 years. And I've gone on to, I'm the co-chair of the Haida Repatriation Committee. I am an advisor on the BC Museums Association. And I am a PhD candidate at SFU, and I'm studying Haida museum practice. So I'm very much involved in the repatriation of the tangible and intangible belongings. There's 12,000 belongings out there in the world that we can identify as Haida. And I've been at the forefront of bringing home over 500 of our ancestors and putting them to rest. Didn't realize it at the time how big of a job that would be. You know, I was in my 20s when I started, and it's really been a lifelong journey for me and for the Haida community. And I'm glad, I'm just so grateful, Hawa, for the invitation to come and speak. And it's an honor to sit amongst you and share what I know and what I've done. How Dalang Afkil
Jahala for joining us and for bringing back so many of our ancestors. Jahala. April?
Chimai Aptahatna Ishigmuk Mirkansatsdun April Laktonen Counceller. My family is from the village of Larsen Bay, and I also have connections to the island of Afognak and the village of Karluk here in the Kodiak archipelago. I've lived in the town of Kodiak since elementary school, and I consider Kodiak now to be my home, although I'm so very proud of having spent my childhood in the village of Larsen Bay. Larsen Bay was the one of the first villages to secure a major repatriation in 1990. Separate from Nagpra, our village received over 800 of our ancestors back from the Smithsonian Institution, and it had taken over a decade with lawyers and all these studies to try to prove whether or not my village were the lineal descendants of those individuals represented in the collection at the Smithsonian. I was still, I think, in middle school at the time of that repatriation. I did not understand what was going on. I had seen the big cross in my village from where they had reburied all of those ancestors, and I did not understand until much later when I was in college at Brown University, and I was taking a class called the Archaeology of Death. And when I looked at the syllabus, I found that my home village was the case study about repatriation. And I contacted my professor because I was very concerned that the class was going to be focusing on the funerary practices of those ancestors and focusing on the arguments between different scientists of whether or not we were the legitimate descendants of those ancestors. So that was my first real encounter with repatriation and the way that our people and our ancestors are talked about in the scientific community. In my professional life, I started working with the language before I really got into repatriation work. And one of the biggest ones that I worked on was the Chirikov repatriation in 2018, which was approximately 125 or more individuals. And in that situation, it feels like in every repatriation, there's always someone fighting back or refusing to cooperate or cooperating grudgingly. And that one was, it had reopened some traumas in our community, because although our museum had been working for over 15 years to secure the repatriation of those ancestors, we were met with a real lack of cooperation from the university that held them, claiming that they had no responsibility to return them because they did not own the collection. In the aftermath of that repatriation, I worked with people in my community to establish the Alutiiq Ancestors Memorial, which is a small park that attempts in very gentle ways to teach the community at large, well, first of all, who the Alutiiq people even are, because we're really far behind in that area in the broader community, but also about respecting ancestral sites, ancestral burials, and why it's important to repatriate our ancestors. There's a lot more that I could probably say in my introduction, but I do just want to say that I'm honored to be among these other practitioners working so hard to make sure that museums, institutions, universities that hold the remains of our ancestors, fighting for them to be returned home. In all of the work that I have done in my life, I think that repatriation of our ancestors is the most honorable and the most meaningful work that I have done. And I am hoping that I'm able to help with so many more in the future. This morning, when I got on Facebook, one of my friends from college had posted something from the Federal Register, which really just kind of felt like a punch in the gut when I saw the number of individuals in this planned repatriation. Right now, the Federal Register has a notice about the repatriation of a collection of 10,245 at minimum ancestors from the Kushala, Seminole, Chickasaw, Muskogee Creek, and Choctaw tribes. To know that a collection of that size has not entered the repatriation process until now is absolutely shocking to me. And it shows the continued value of this work, the continued need for education on this topic. And I just feel so much for those descendants and those tribes that are now finding out that over 10,000 of their ancestors have been in storage this entire time since the passage of NAGPRA. Thank you.
Koyana, April, and thank you folks for the introductions. You've already somewhat touched on our first question, and I'm thankful that the work that you do hits you so hard that it just jumps up, and it is a part of all the things that you do on a regular basis. But the first question, and as I said, some of you have already kind of answered this, but what does repatriation and the returning of our ancestors mean to you and your community, tribe, clan? What does it mean to you and your community? And maybe we'll start with Bob. Do you feel comfortable answering first?
I started doing this work back in 1983, where in the back of our village, there were a number of graves that were desecrated and graves were robbed, artifacts were taken, and the whole cemetery was completely desecrated. It was very painful time for me to see the desecration of our cemetery sites and the looting of our graves. I had no idea that went on. And back then, there were no laws protecting cemeteries or sacred sites. And people would build homes on top of cemeteries, take the artifacts, sell the artifacts, and have enough money to pay for their home. And they thought it was okay to do that kind of thing. And back then, Native Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives weren't treated so well. And the dead were treated even worse. It was socially acceptable to destroy Native American graves back then. And 1986, I became more involved when there were more destruction going on and more robbing of graves. I was shocked that there were human beings that would do such a thing. So I stepped up and I gathered up all those remains and I began to rebury them. That was the beginning of my life with human remains. And I don't think I've ever recovered from that. It's one of the things that keeps me going. When you see a whole mound of desecrated bodies destroyed, and they're like my own relatives. And these were Christian burials. These were not old graves. So they were like my uncles and grandparents and own family. So I reburied them as much as I can. And as time went on, I was called to go to California, Berkeley, and other places to help other tribes with human remains. And when I started to travel before NAGPRA, it was the most dangerous time of my life. People don't realize back then that Native people were actually killed and murdered just for the fact that they were protecting their ancestors' burial ground. There were people dying back then, murdered, so that profit-making people could take over the land and profit by selling of artifacts. So people were dying before NAGPRA. And you know those old Native American movies back in the 70s and 80s where they were destroying Native cemeteries, and there were Native people who would say, I would give my life to protect my ancestors. That's what I did. I put my life to protect them and to make sure that that never happens again. And then 1990 came along with NAGPRA. And by then I was part of NCAI, going to meetings with other tribal leaders across the country. And we fought for the NAGPRA law. Back then, there were human remains on display at museums, artifacts, funerary objects on display. My own great-grandfather was on display. His funerary objects were held by a museum in New York and Washington, D.C. So I worked with the Central Council to bring my grandfather home. And it was quite an education for me, because at that time I realized the tens of thousands of American Indian, Alaska Natives held at museums across the country. Berkeley, 18,000. Smithsonian, 12,000. New York, 10,000. Why? Why? And to listen to a museum say, these remains don't belong to you. They belong to the museum. It's our property. How can they say such a thing? So back then we fought for lineal descendants. Anyone who is a lineal descendant, we worked with and made sure that the NAGPRA law addressed lineal descendants. And we really worked very hard. The other thing is, this law is called Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So back in the 80s and 90s, the focus was on graves, bringing the bodies home. And so I really dedicated my whole life and willing to die to bring our ancestors home. I am willing to die for this. Repatriation has changed my life. It's made it more focused on respect for ancestors. And it was like purgatory in the beginning, because I don't think we were prepared or we were trained to touch a human body, rebury a human body. So I spent my whole life bringing bodies home from institutions, sanitariums, museums. It was such a wonderful thing to bring my grandfather home, place him back where he belonged. It created a healing opportunity for me personally. And it provided something fulfilling in my spirit, made me a whole human being. And I continue to do this work because it's the right thing to do. And I don't refer to these bodies as American Indian, Alaska Native. I refer to them as human beings. And I educate the museums and the institutions, and I tell them, these are human beings just like you. And if we work together and do the correct thing, it will heal both of us. So this is amazing. Our ancestors have really powerful souls and spirits. They must really know that we are prepared for them, or they are preparing us, or leading us. So the people that we are part of now today, we're strong. Our culture is strong. So let's bring our ancestors home, do the right thing, thrive, drum, sing, speak our language, do our ceremonies, because that's why they took them away in the first place, is so that they could destroy us. But they did not do that. It just made us more strong. I love this work. It's very, very rewarding for me to see our ancestors come home. I just wish that we could focus back on Native American graves protection and repatriation of our ancestors. Focus on that. Anyway, thank you.
Nishtish, Shaagunastaa. Sdaahl.
Oh, so this is a big question. What does repatriation mean to me and to the Haida? I guess I'll start with my own why I got involved in the calling, I guess, that I heard. I was an intern at the Provincial Museum, the Royal BC Museum, and working late at night, and I could hear children playing in the museum, but there's nobody else in the museum, but me and the ancestors at 11 at night. And I didn't realize that was my ancestors calling to me, to this work. And I thought I could just go home and tell Chief and Council they should do something about it. But really, once I called the meeting, it was the leaders that called me to this work. The grandmothers, the Nonalung, called me to this work, and I was so young and naive and really scared that I would have to lead this. So it really took me a while to kind of gather myself and lead repatriation for our nation. And it really became about bringing the community together, learning these ceremonies, learning the language around repatriation, around caring for the ancestors, learning the protocols, learning practices, and bringing back things in a bigger way, like doing food burnings, and learning the really how to care for the ancestors. I think as you may know, there's kind of strict protocols of how we care for the dead. So we had to kind of relearn how to do that with care for the ancestors without knowing who exactly they were, what, if they were eagle or raven, and how to handle them and take good care of them. So we really had to kind of rethink how to do repatriation, and learn how to pray and to like speak to the ancestors and get their guidance and pay attention to that. So it really was a lifelong learning for the community. I like to say that we were reconciling before the word reconciliation was thrown around so much as it is in Canada. I don't know about in the United States if that's such a big thing as it is here, but all the museums are all about reconciliation now, but not quite knowing what that means. And for the Haida, the concept of toyata, to make it right, is an act of reconciliation. So for me, it was about making it right, taking our ancestors home, laying them to rest. That was making it right. The concept of in Haida, the lease, the like invisible string that connects us to our ancestors. That I could feel that tugging on me to stay connected to our Kunisi, and to stay connected to the belongings in the museums. And I know that with our repatriation committee, we have a pretty strong committee of Haidas from Old Masset, Skidegate, in Alaska, that we meet on a regular basis. And the committee has grown and changed over the years, but there really is a sense of unity amongst that committee and responsibility. We feel it. We feel that responsibility, and it weighs heavy, but also that joy of being a part of this and caring for our ancestors. That's a big reason to do this work, and I think that's what kind of keeps us going and keeps us working with museums to pay yakudang respect to our ancestors and to their belongings in museums. I'll pass it on.
April?
I think that, to me, repatriation is about the very most basic core type of human dignity and human rights. And like the other panelists have said, it takes a lot of effort to try to fight back against those age-old stereotypes against Native Americans and their ancestors, and the way that they have been treated, the way that our ancestors have been treated like objects. And so for me, returning those rights to our ancestors of being a full human being, the basic dignity of knowing that your final resting place will not be disturbed. To me, that is why repatriation is so important. And the process of bringing home our ancestors, to me, it feels like in some way that we're returning the natural order to the land and to our own people. Because our ancestors, when they were interred long ago, they were supposed to remain as part of the land. They were supposed to go back to the land. And their removal created a wound in our land and in our people that can only really be healed when the right thing is done, and when those ancestors are returned and can be reburied, and that our people know that they will never be disturbed again. That is to me why what repatriation means to me and why it is so important.
A powerful statement from each of you on what it means to you and what it means to your community. Bob, you've been in this work for so long, and I can't imagine and I've heard you speak on what it means to your heart and soul to do this work on a regular basis, and how often you have to do and work on your own healing journey as a result of being in this work. And I'm just so thankful. I want to say Xaadas for the work that you do. And I appreciate what you and Sdaahl were talking about, and thinking through what it took to venture down this path of learning and growing and reconnecting to our protocols, reconnecting to our traditions, and to the requirements that we held in our practices and our spirituality to handle our ancestors, and to be able to care for them, and to be able to bring them back home. And I know that just in the work that the two of you have done, that you have also contributed to the reawakening of some of our own practices of what it means to care for our loved ones who are passing on, who are going into the forest or going into the water. And so I'm thankful that you are connecting those dots. And I could see through your reflection the invisible line that you were speaking of, the one that connects us to our ancestors, the one that connects us to our history and who we are. And boarding schools cut that tie for us, but it was also cut when they removed our ancestors from our homelands. And I thank you, April, for bringing that in as part of the cycle, the circle that our ancestors go back to the land, and then they contribute to the land in the way that they create that circle for us. And you're severing that circle, you're severing that invisible line in our communities and in our homelands when our ancestors go missing and are taken from that circle and that important invisible thread that connects us all. So Xaadas for giving us your amazing thoughts into that first question. I'll turn it over to Laktonen.
I guess the best way to kind of move into the second question is to just simply ask, in your experience and your understanding and what you and your people have gone through in these processes so far, are Indigenous peoples free to practice the spiritual care of our ancestors and other culturally significant items in these museums and similar institutions? Based on the experience that you all have, what are your thoughts about that? So again, the question is, are Indigenous peoples free to practice the spiritual care of our ancestors in these institutions? And we'll start with Sdaahl and then go to April and then Bob. Sdaahl?
Oh, you guys are asking the tough questions. I think this one, is in my over 20 years of experience in museums, it's something that is changing. And I'm glad to see that museums are changing. The people in museums are changing their thinking, but it seems to be a struggle. Every museum we go to, being allowed to use our belongings. Every museum is so different, and even doing some cultural sharing and being able to use some of the belongings from the collection. Every museum has a different approach to that, and different rules, where wearing gloves or having conservators there, that's always a negotiation that has to be had. And I find that we also, with museums, have such little documentation of what they have. So to actually know, when you're only at a museum for a few days and you're looking at all of these belongings from your village, and then you want to engage with something in a more meaningful way, but there's no documentation saying what family those came from. So there's definitely some hesitation about interacting with them, and knowing protocol, knowing what the protocols around what male and female could handle, are if this was medicine man belongings, and there's always the unknown. So I find that that's definitely a learning that we have to go through when we're in museums, and being able to take things home for ceremonial use. I see a change in that happening as well. So for instance, a couple years ago, I think Guja, when he became Chief Xaadas, was able to bring home a huge bentwood box, and that had to come with conservator, I think with a curator, and to have it sit in the potlatch, they had to have kind of it had to be kind of blocked off from the public, but to see the change happening in the museum people when they got excited and in the moment, being at the ceremony at the a huge potlatch, and to be not so clingy and feeling like they own that, for them to open up to it when the clan put coppers inside the box to give away. So it really seems to be that museum folks also need to go along on a learning journey of the importance of these belongings, and really need to be to come home, to come to Haida Gwaii, go to Alaska and see the people, and get to know the people, and get to understand what the importance of our property. That kind of it definitely needs to be happening more. And it's expensive. That was thousands of dollars that had to be raised when that box came home and had to be sent back to the museum. Thousands and thousands of dollars for that to be just transported there and back. So definitely there needs to be a lot more change that happens to give us more access, and to be using our property, and repatriating our property for that use. How next?
Yeah, Jahal, thank you so much, Dathkawas. April?
So I can speak to how things work at the museum where I work here at the Alutiiq Museum. I can share what is done, and I think a little bit about what the possibilities are. In our community, we don't have as much knowledge of our traditional spiritual practices as we would like, but we do know certain things. And so we do have a spiritual care of collections policy at the Alutiiq Museum, where certain objects are stored in certain ways. For example, oil lamps are always stored upside down because we know that traditionally the spirit of the lamp could escape if it is stored right side up, unless it is being used and burned at the time. So in our collections room, we do have all of our oil lamps stored in that manner. We also have begun incorporating traditional names for objects, and even working with elders to recreate names in our language that have been lost to time. We also have a spiritual and sacred area in our collections room that is not available for people to see. That small area contains objects that may be pending reburial, or that may be known to be very spiritually powerful. We know that there are objects that are not supposed to be handled by women because of the special powers that women have. And those include sometimes weapons, but they also include certain objects from the Russian Orthodox faith, because that is really important in our community and almost is, it's in some ways integrated into our contemporary culture. So one example is a Russian Orthodox Christmas star that is used in starring celebrations, and it is on a special loan from one of the villages on the island. And when we need to handle it, we try to be respectful of the fact that women traditionally were not supposed to handle these objects. And that particular star can be checked out by the community. We have it flown out to the village. They use it for the Russian Orthodox starring. Sometimes they repair it, and then they send it back and it goes back into the collections. As a woman, sometimes I feel a little bit strange about some of those spiritual guidelines because at least on the Russian Orthodox side, my personal opinion is that some of it comes from sexism. But at the same time, I try to put aside my personal feelings, especially with the older objects, where certain items related to women's menstruation should not be handled by men. And then other objects related to hunting should not be handled by women. In the case of human remains, in the past, we have had blessings and visits by Alutiiq dance groups to give like a cultural blessing, as well as by a Russian Orthodox priest who is very close to our community and is respectful of our cultural traditions. I think one of the reasons that we have not had many conflicts between our traditional spiritual uses of museum collections and the Russian Orthodox is because of the fact that a lot of our traditional religious beliefs have not survived to the modern day, and we just don't know about them. So we practice, cultural ceremonies, but without the full understanding of what our traditional spirituality entailed. A lot of that traditional spirituality has come down to us in the form of cultural values. So we use those cultural values to inform some of our behavior. But, we're in a position of having to relearn what that traditional spirituality looked like. And so we don't have many examples of cases where community members have asked to visit our cultural objects for the purpose of spiritual care. Usually it's about reconnecting to the ancestors, about reconnecting to the culture, learning what our ancestors were capable of, and less about providing spiritual care in the way that I have seen with other tribes who may have a stronger connection to that traditional knowledge.
Goodness, geez. Brianna, April, Bob?
Thank you for allowing me time to think about this question. I started going to museums back in 1993, and I've been able to bring back remains with the museums, such as the Smithsonian and the American Museum of Natural History, the Denver Art Museum, in the Burke Museum in Seattle. I brought a number of human remains back, and the museums were very good with working with me. Very good, especially the Smithsonian, who has their own policy rather than following a law. They had their own repatriation policy. And they had a ceremonial room that they built specifically for repatriation of human remains. And so that was very good. And the same with New York. There is one that I need to mention. I've been involved with repatriation of very old bodies. I've reburied the On Your Knees cave man. And that one was a powerful experience for me. I got a phone call, and one of the questions they asked was, they considered this body shaman or if, and what my thoughts were. And after careful thinking, I said, let's treat the body the way we would treat any human being. And since we're Tlingit and Haidas, we have our mortuary practices still alive today. So let's treat this body the way we would treat any of our people. So that's what we did. And then there was another case, which is a little more sensitive, that I need to bring up. It's in regards to mummy or ich. And this mummy was the real thing. A mummy taken from Sitka. We had a meeting in 1989 before NAGPRA about that particular mummy. The real thing. The elderly people at the time, we had a cultural committee meeting. The museum offered to bring that body home. And this was before NAGPRA. They met with the elders, and at the time I was restoring the cemetery, so they invited me as well. I was not an elder. I attended the meeting with the elders, and the museum presented the case to us. It was a mummy that predicted the Battle of 1802 here in Sitka. It was a female mummy, female shaman, who predicted the war of 1802, that the Tlingit people would win. The elders talked about it, and they talked about shamanism and how powerful shamanism is among our people. Powerful, powerful. And the museum asked if they could bring the body home in 1989. One elder got up and nominated me to bring the body home because of my work. Another elder got up and agreed that I should be the one to bring the body home. But this other elder said something that made the conversation even longer. He said, and only another ich can touch an ich. And if somebody is unprepared to do this, like myself, I would suffer. I would lose my job. I would lose my way. I would even go a little bit crazy. And I was too young. And that elder wanted to protect me. So he recommended that I wait until I become an old man. He said, you're too young. You will suffer and maybe die. So the museum agreed to wait for me to become an old man. 2 years ago, we got a notice from that museum, and I prepared myself to go down and to bring the body home. And I worked with museum staff, and I prayed. I really, really prayed hard. I worked with the staff. I prepared myself. I made sure that I had no anger in me. I worked out a lot of my grief and sorrow and anger and set it all aside. And they allowed me to go into that room where the mummy was. And I talked to it. And I told it that I was going to bring her home. And then they prepared the box. And I made sure that everyone was in a good way. If anyone came into the room that I could sense had issues, I would ask them to leave. Even myself, I wouldn't go if I wasn't in a good way. So I escorted the body home. I took it to the National Park Service and stored it for a few days. And I went out and I prepared the cave for it to go in. A complete mummy, female mummy. So there were ich shamans that were both female and male in our culture. So I prepared that cave and found the hole and I went to get the mummy. I was the only one that touched it. I made sure nobody was around me. Protected people. I sacrificed myself. I put my life in God's hands and said my prayers. And I was prepared for anything, even death. When I lifted up that mummy, it was like a feather. It was so light. You could lift it up with one hand. And I placed it into the hole. This mummy was robbed long ago and placed on display. So I apologized to it. And then by that time, I was very professional about it. I completely closed off that cave, completely. Nothing can get into it anymore. Nothing. And the mummy went back to the earth. It can never be taken again. I have suffered from this work. I have lost all my possessions. I've had near-death experiences the last 2 years. So this is something very, very sensitive. And I've never been the same since. But I'm an older person now, so I'm very happy that that particular mummy is at rest in peace. I can feel it. She wanted to come home. I could feel it. So it was the right thing to do, and it was the right timing. Timing is important. You can't just do this work without doing the right thing. There's a lot of our spiritual people out there still, deeply, deeply spiritual. And so we are preparing ourselves to doing very sacred work. And it requires belief, a strong belief, a strong faith. And yes, faith in God is the most powerful. So I put my life in God's hands, and I feel comfortable with that. And I have no regrets to the work that I've done and the bodies that I've placed back into the earth. I feel the comfort. So life is good. Thank you.
Xaadas, Bob, I feel like you took me on a little bit of a journey in your sharing, and I just wanted to reflect that the wisdom of the elder and yourself when you were that young man, to acknowledge that spiritual responsibility in that institution that you're at, and then have that institution and yourself have that long-term vision of what was going to happen, take place, is such a powerful story. And I'm grateful for you making that sacrifice, knowing that even as an elder now and having the ability to stand in those shoes of someone more prepared to bring that ancestor home, that it would still have consequences. And I think that's something that I'm going to be thinking about for a while, is that the longevity of that commitment and then the enactment of it. So, Anishchish Hawa. And April, as I thought about how you were sharing, and thank you so much for sharing your spiritual care guidelines. I kind of glanced through it really quickly, and it's just really already, just from that quick glance, just so powerful. What an amazing touchstone to have for yourself and for your staff at the museum and for the community. That's really wonderful. Something that you said really kind of stood out to me as well was kind of the acknowledgement of the impact of colonization on how we interpret spiritual care, and trying to find the right lens by which to support the community continuing to use and practice whatever their belief is. Like Bob said, you know, the spiritual care work, this is sacred work and it requires belief. And to be able to be in a place where you're navigating that really hard line between your personal understanding and knowledge and wisdom, and also being in support of the community, for the community's continued use of these belongings. I thought that was really, I thought that was such a really critical point to be thinking about what the church, for instance, might teach about the role of genders, which may be much different than where we are today, and understanding as we continue to reestablish our connection to who we are as Indigenous people and enact the knowledge of our ancestors. So Chish for sharing that. I know that's can be a touchy subject for some people, but we have to be able to talk about those things. Sdaahl Kawas, as I was writing out the question so that I could say it with the care that was needed, I struggled in talking about, I can talk about our ancestors, but talking about the quote unquote physical pieces, tangible pieces of our culture that are still held as well, that carry spiritual significance, that have a connection to our people and our usage of it. And I struggled to find the right word. And you kept using the right word over and over again. You kept saying belongings. You didn't say objects. You didn't say items. You didn't disconnect them from the humanity and the creativity that created them. You referred to them as belongings. And I guess in a Western sense, belongings could probably maybe mean ownership or property to some people. But in our Native worldview, everything is about relationship and being related, and about being connected and belonging. We belong to our clan, we belong to our people, in the same way that these belongings have a spiritual force of their own. And that was really helpful for me. So taho'a. I also appreciated that you shared, that while it's changing in museums right now, and it's been changing for a little while, it's also always a negotiation still. And to think about, what is the next iteration of this growth in this change, this transformation, right? What is the next iteration of it? So when you were talking about it, I was like, if today we are still negotiating over our ability to be in connection and relationship to our ancestors or to our belongings, then what will tomorrow look like? What is the evolution of that relationship so that we can shift from a place of negotiation, because that is not healthy. And it's also an adversarial relationship right from the start. And so I think that was a really important point, even though it's hard to talk about and we try to make things pleasant as possible, it's still a negotiation. And so I think that's a really important piece of understanding, kind of taking the temperature of where we are right now and where we want to be is different than where we are today. So Gunishish, to all three of you for your sharing. I really, I'm going to be chewing on some of the things that you shared for a while. So how, what like you duck?
Gunishish, Maganai, for that reflection and for the words from our guest speakers. Under the same lines, this next question is pretty closely connected to the one you just answered. But as we're thinking about our connection, what is keeping us from repatriation and ceremonial use? What are the barriers that we're encountering that are keeping us from repatriation and ceremonial use? And maybe this time we'll start with April and go to Sdaahl and then Bob.
I think that there are a number of obstacles to repatriation and ceremonial use. In terms of repatriation, I think one of the things that I have seen in my experiences with repatriation is the issue of academic imperialism, where there are lifetime professionals in universities and museums who have built their careers on the study of our ancestors' remains. And they have not held themselves to a standard of behavior that would be acceptable to the Native community. In the Chirikov repatriation, before I became involved, the Alutiiq Museum under two previous directors had been working on the same repatriation for about 15 years, getting such little progress each year that we sometimes didn't know if there would ever be a repatriation at the end of it. And we knew from some old emails that the professor that had the remains in her bone lab, we knew that she had told someone at the Fish and Wildlife Service that she had 2.5 linear feet of files about what had been done with the remains while they were in her possession. But when it finally came time to have those ancestors repatriated, suddenly there was no record of any research that had ever been done on those ancestral remains, even though we had a copy of the email that she had sent to someone else. And so we wrote a letter to that university begging to have that information released. And their first response was, well, you can look it up on JSTOR. You can search, the academic journals to find out what had been done. And we said, that's not acceptable to our community who, not everyone has a subscription to JSTOR, and shouldn't it be on the responsibility of the researcher to share the information back to the community? Because our museum had access or could gain access, we knew that research had been done about tuberculosis and about syphilis and other diseases. And we knew that that information had never been shared back to the Native community. It felt like they were circling the wagons. We felt like there was a wall between our organization representing the Native community and the university that had the remains. They also said they didn't have the money to return the remains. So we had a grant awarded to us that the National Park Service had to take back so that they could use the money to recatalog all the remains that we knew had already been cataloged through 30 or more years of research in this university bone lab. We then sought out help from the Russian Orthodox Church. We asked the Bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church of America to write a letter to the Board of Regents of the University of Indiana at Bloomington, asking to have the records of what had been done to those ancestors to be released. The response from the university regents was that no such records existed. And the bishop was upset. He was upset with us because he thought that we had misled him, that there were records when the university claimed that there were not. And we had to tell him that this was a lie, that the university was lying on behalf of the professor who did not want to lose control over the research that had been done in her name throughout her career. We almost wanted to send a spy in to try to register for one of her classes so that they could go in and see what was really going on. In the end, we never got that information. We never got that research. We think that it was probably removed from the school. We don't really know. Maybe it's still sitting in her university laboratory or in the files from the Department of Anthropology at that university. But we realized that we were not going to get it, that we needed to refocus our attention on those ancestors that were coming home. But you can tell by this story that I am still very angry about how our community was treated and how the legitimate claims of our community over the research that had been done, and simply wanting to know, what did they do with those ancestors? Why did we receive some of those bones back that were cut into little slices? And we know that we're never going to know that, and that still does hurt me inside. So this type of attitude that we encountered in this one repatriation is still common across the United States. It is common in these universities. These professionals, these academics have built their career and earned money off of the study of our ancestors' bones. And they feel like they have an ownership over those bones because of it. And not only over the bones, they feel like they have ownership over the research. And so to me, there are many barriers that keep us from repatriation and ceremonial use. But I think academic imperialism in the way that I have described is one of the biggest underlying problems that contributes to many of the other problems that we face in being successful in bringing our ancestors home. Thank you.
Koyana, thank you, April, for sharing that story with us. That really, makes me angry and heartbroken and all the things. And I'm thankful that you shared that with us so that folks could have a real understanding of what it takes to bring our ancestors home and the barriers that you encountered. Koyana. Sdaahl.
I think I will speak to two things that come to mind, and the first one is about the laws and the policies that are written that haven't been rewritten. That's a pretty big issue, and how they are just so different in every country, and then in Canada, you know, even within our provinces, the laws and policies of museums and universities are all so different, and that really can be a barrier. When I worked at the provincial museum, I helped to revamp the repatriation and Indigenous collections policy, and I worked with the curator, who is a very good writer, to change, to make those changes, and then to down the road to have this curator throw it in my face when the Haida had asked for. We changed the policy to say that anything within the collection is up for repatriation. It doesn't have to be spiritual or ceremonial use, you know, which anybody could argue for or against. And there was no time limit on it. There was no any kind of restraints. We tried to remove those from the policy. So, you know, when the Haida repatriation asked for 5 belongings out of the 2,000 Haida belongings in the collection, including a couple of masks by a well-known Haida carver, she was just enraged. She came and threw a piece of paper at me with she printed off a picture of a mask that had obviously come from a grave. It was, you know, had wormholes in it. It was very old. And she's like, "How dare you ask for these masks? You need to ask for this one. This one is more appropriate for you to repatriate." And then she wouldn't let go of that. You know, when the repatriation committee brought it up again, what's happening with the repatriation, and she, you know, went on to get angry and screamed at me in front of, you know, a lot of other people that the Haida have no right to treat this museum like a grocery store. She no longer works there. This, you know, for somebody who can write so well and make it look like she was a part of wanting this change, you know, her true colors really came out. And then the stories started to come out about the museum and how different people within the institution were not walking the talk. So I think that happens a lot in museums when the staff are not being watched and held accountable for their actions and their words. Another thing I'll mention is the gap in our knowledge about the Gingay, about the property. You know, the record keeping, as we know, is so bad. So really, they did not really keep much information on who these belongings belong to, what clan affiliation, what they were used for, what village, when it was collected. All of that important information is so limited. And you know, one thing sticks out in my mind I really wish we knew more about was these little carved salmon figures. There are two of them in a museum in the UK, and the only little handwritten notes from I think it was from a missionary wrote that they were used in ceremony when the salmon stocks were low. You know, I sure wish there was more documentation on that so that we could be recreating those and using those in ceremony right now when we sure need it. How I'll leave it there.
Tahala. Thank you, Sdaahl. Bob?
There are a number of obstacles that we face and that have already been spoken of by the other panelists. The word that I learned in 1990 with NAGPRA, I used to think it sounded so cool the way it rolled off your tongue. It's called preponderance of evidence. When I first heard that term, I thought, wow, that is so cool. But then when I found out the meaning of it, that's when it all changed. When the museums would tell us, you have to prove that this is yours. And then in the same law, it states inherent rights of Indigenous people. So how can somebody that don't own the object in the first place tell you you have to prove that you own it? And I wondered about that for a long time. And these museums think they actually own the remains or funerary object, when lineal descendants have to prove so much. And language is another barrier where we had to really learn the NAGPRA language, the dialect of NAGPRA, to understand it. And we had to be good human beings all the time, and to watch ourselves, prepare ourselves is an ongoing thing. And in time, we've become spiritual people. We had to learn the hard way of reburials and pass this down to the next generation. Preponderance of evidence is, it shouldn't, for those who have inherent rights, it shouldn't be imposed on them so abruptly, so harshly. And I have been doing this work for a while, and this is a sensitive part. I don't know how to express it, but we were supposed to be protecting graves protection. It bothered me in 1990, at the very last moment, they put in objects of cultural patrimony. That actually slowed down the process of bringing home human remains. And people concentrate on objects of cultural patrimony, which is okay. We got those, it's good to bring those back, but it shouldn't have been at the expense of our ancestors who are currently being held in the museums and institutions. We should focus on really bringing those bodies home. Recently, NAGPRA has understood that and are addressing it as we speak. So there's a lot of obstacles. The other one is we lost so many of our elders, especially the last 2 years. We've lost many. language fluent speakers, ceremonial people, we lost them. And so we have to know our history. In 1838, with the diseases in Alaska, 90% of our people died, which made all our objects masterless. So from that time on, many of our objects ended up in museums and institutions because they were masterless. And the information is very sketchy at best. So now we're at the population of where our people were before contact. So we're becoming healthy. So let's bring our people and objects home. Thank you.
Thank you, folks, for sharing those powerful stories. April, man, you had me really choked up with your story, and I can't imagine taking an ancestor and disrespecting it and dehumanizing it to the point that you decide to chop it up and analyze its bone structure and doing the horrible things. Sounds like a horror movie to me. And I can't imagine what it was like not knowing what was done to your ancestor and just having to put the pieces together and just guess. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. And I'm sorry your people had to go through that. It's really heartbreaking. But I appreciate you sharing this story here because this story is gonna live for a while so that others know, and so that folks who are online and witnessing this understand the importance of treating our belongings, treating our people with care and respect as they would their own ancestor, and no longer, as you said before, continuing and perpetuating dehumanizing of who we are as Native people. And I appreciate that perspective that you continuously bring. And as I'm thinking about how I, as a Haida woman, can get pretty fierce and fiery sometimes, I can only imagine, Sdaahl, your reaction to that woman who made the comment about their museum being like a grocery store for the Haida people. And I cannot imagine the fight and the battle. I can't imagine, I'll say, I can't imagine the fight and the battle that went through you at that time to ensure that woman understood that this, because our ancestral belongings were in her caretaking, did not mean that they belonged to her. And it did not mean that they belonged to that museum. And I certainly appreciate the arrogance that I could see in the woman that you encountered in that time and in that space. And, you know, speaking of arrogance, Bob, you know, as we're thinking about the preponderance of evidence, I'd never heard that before. This is a new space to me in talking about repatriation and talking about museums. And I appreciate that you brought that in. It is arrogant to have to be at the receiving end and demanding that we prove to those who are holding on to our belongings and our ancestral relatives, that we prove that they came from us. And especially when they're holding on to stolen items, it just breaks my heart, and I can't get over what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of finally being at the tipping point of bringing this culture home, bringing these sacred beings and objects and belongings home to our community, so that we can piece together a broken history, to only be told that you have to prove, probably beyond a reasonable doubt, that these these belongings actually belong to you and your people. So I appreciate you bringing that perspective in, and also really connecting us to that history, the lived history of our people, of seeing so many of our people pass away due to disease. And now we're flourishing again, and our clans are flourishing again. And now it's the time to reconnect, to reawaken, and to draw those correlations. So I appreciate the perspectives that the three of you brought in for this topic. Lagune.
Yeah, I don't know about others who are watching the webinar, but I know for myself, you folks are taking me on an emotional journey here. I'm like enraged in one moment and really brokenhearted in another, and then also super grateful that we have people like you folks in here doing this work. And I appreciate so much the knowledge that you are so openly sharing with folks. And I know, that this is just the beginning parts of this conversation, right? There's so much more to go into the details of the ramifications of what this means for us, what those experiences are like. And as we think about what that looks like for our people, the question that I want to ask you folks next is about what the institutions and the systems need to shift in order for this to be better, in order for us to do better, and in order for these circumstances, these stories that you folks just shared, so those things don't happen anymore. What are the systemic and institutional shifts that need to happen? And I'll start with, let's see, I'll start with Sdaahl and then go to Bob and then April.
I think museums definitely need to acknowledge their colonial history and acknowledge that these belongings and our ancestors came to them in mostly suspicious ways, and at times of duress, and to acknowledge that they need to be a part of making this change. They need to be part of the reconciliation that needs to happen. They need to focus on EDIA training for their staffs, for their boards. There needs to be more Indigenous representation at all levels within the institutions, and more protection for the Indigenous people that work within these institutions and sit on museum boards. In Canada, there is we don't have a NAGPRA similar law, so that means there's no Canadian funding for repatriation. It's for all of our repatriation that we did, traveling to a dozen or so museums to bring home our ancestors, probably cost us $1 million. At least. And that was all us fundraising, contributing our own funding and piecing together little like art grants or church grants, things like that to make it work. But the government really does need to step up and fund repatriation, and funding for repatriation also needs to be more supported within museums. So I've been in both. I've been on both sides. I think as a repatriation committee member, and then as a museum manager, and seeing just how much work it takes on the museum end to be ready for repatriation. That really needs to be more supported as well. And the financial support for the communities, costs a lot of money to bring our belongings and ancestors home. It costs a lot of money to put a roof over them, to care for them the way the communities want to. That's really a huge issue for the Haida now. You know, we struggle with, you know, museums are really coming to be more eager to repatriate, but we're running out of space at the Haida Gwaii Museum, and we don't have a facility in Old Masset yet. So we have to really be picky and choosy of what we do bring back. And, you know, that's a sad place to be. And I do think that there's also a shift that needs to happen with Indigenous people becoming stronger watchmen and watching over museums and the processes, to be scanale, to be, you know, the watching the museums, watching over our ancestors, our grave sites, and watching over the government and the people that are working within institutions, and holding them accountable for repatriation. That really needs to happen more.
These are really powerful questions that are being asked, pretty heavy for me. And I have to really think and wonder about my own words. I think that we have to go back a long ways, back to the Pope, back to the doctrine of discovery and what they call manifest destiny. I personally think that they need to rescind the doctrine of discovery and redefine manifest destiny. They really have no right over our lives. And everyone, all living things, has the inherent right to walk from the top of the mountains to the oceans. It doesn't belong to just one race. That has to be addressed. And the fact that we're talking about human remains, not Native American, not Asian, not Black, but human remains. And as a people, what do we do when we walk by and we see a body at the side of the street? It's humanity to do the right thing, to take that body and do the respectful thing. There should be no question. And even among the countries who go to war with each other, sometimes they stop that war so that we could gather our dead. It's a civilized custom to take care of our dead. So what I'm saying as a people, and it's something that I try to practice, is we have to take our rightful place in society as human beings, taking care of our dead with dignity, respect, and honor. There should be no question about that. We're not museum pieces. We're not artifacts. We are a cultural people, and we have something to offer you. I want to touch you, not up here You're too smart and too intelligent. You have PhDs and masters up here. This kind of work, you have to be touched here. This is where our humanity lives. So let's be human together and bring our people home with dignity, respect, and honor. Thank you.
Ashish, Bob. Ashish. April?
So, in terms of systemic shifts, I think there's a couple of things. And I was actually looking at the original question list about what museum or institutions need to understand and what they need to do better. But I think the two questions are very similar. So I'm going to speak to them kind of at the same time. I think that these institutions need to understand that as time has gone by, Native communities are talking to each other more than ever. We are sharing information. And so when there is an institution that is not being a good neighbor, when they are not cooperating, when they're putting up barriers, other Native American tribes and communities will find out. And I think that so often these universities and museums, when they're talking to themselves, they don't even realize that there are others watching and listening. That is kind of connected to my next point in terms of creating systemic shifts. There's an imbalance and an inequity in the funding that is provided to the Native communities who are trying to bring their ancestors home, and the universities and museums that have the capacity to apply for large-scale grants to do repatriation. So the university that I have mentioned a couple of times that we had a difficult repatriation with, at the same time as we were working on the Chiricahua repatriation and seeking out a donation from the city of a gravesite for our ancestors because our tribe did not own land and we didn't have any funding to even buy a $300 gravesite. This university had a $200,000 NSF grant. And part of that grant was to bring in tribes to teach them how to do repatriation. And the irony of that just still makes me astounded to this day. I would love help in figuring out how much money has gone to these institutions that say they don't have the money to repatriate our ancestors in comparison to the money that has gone to tribes and tribal organizations that are trying to bring the ancestors home. Money is almost always an excuse. Oh, we just don't have funding. Oh, sorry, we just don't have the resources to send your ancestors home right now. But then you look on the National Science Foundation website and you find out that they have a big grant to do repatriation and to teach others how to do it the right way. It's an insult to our people and our practice of the Native community trying to get these ancestors home. And I think that we do need to start looking into this, looking into the numbers and calling those institutions to account for what they are doing or not doing. And the biggest insult is not involving the Native community. If you have a big repatriation that needs to be done and you need to apply to an NSF grant to get that done, how come the Native community that is trying to repatriate isn't getting any of that funding? We have had some partnerships where we've been able to get subawards where universities have a big grant to do their repatriation. But if you look at the share of that grant that goes to the Native community, maybe $2,500 out of $100,000 grant, where they are paying the salary of somebody to work full time at the university to help facilitate that repatriation to happen. So if anyone wants to work with me on this, I think this conversation today has gotten me fired up a little bit, wanting to actually look at those numbers and figure out if we can maybe make some larger changes by publicizing the inequities that are involved.
Yeah, how going on at April. You, all three of you have brought up some really, really important points, and I hope some learning opportunities for folks who are at these institutions and systems and be able to reflect on where they're currently at, and hopefully use that to motivate some action to move beyond the challenges and the barriers that you folks have shared here. I really want to reflect back to each of you something that you shared with me, but in the interest of time, I'm going to hand it over to Alutiiq to ask our next question.
Yeah, Hawa. Our last question that we have, and maybe we'll have time for our guests who are with us, our participants, to ask questions if we have enough time. But the question that we had written that you received is, if we designed our own repatriation process that others had to follow, how would that look? How would that be different from the current, what we currently have? So designing our own repatriation process. And we'll start with Bob, and then go to April, and then Sdaahl.
Another difficult question again. This is a recent one, actually, to look into the future. I often think about Indigenous people. We were never intended to be angry or hateful towards other cultures. I think that as a people, we've always been true human beings, I guess is a word for it. You know, Tlingit human, Haida human, you know, we're human. And to some of us, we're the real human beings. We have something in our culture, in our DNA, in our soul that is pretty special. We remember ancient time, and we remember the old stories of how we treat each other, and we remember our humanity in how we treat other races of people. And so I would hope that we will treat all people the same, set aside the hardship that we've suffered, build on our pain, and to grow from it, because that's who we are, and to look at our humor, because humor heals us, and to be allowed for us. I really see this as a vision of the next millennium, that when our ancestors come home, we put regalia back on them, we sing for them, we speak the language, and we do our ceremony. In 1,000 years from now, we're still be doing this kind of thing. Wonderful. Wonderful. My prayer is for us to take our rightful place as human beings and to learn from this and to teach other human beings what they lost. Indigenous people, in a sense, never lost their identity. We think we did, but we never lost it. So we have something to teach, something beautiful about being a real human being. It is said there's only 2% of indigenous people left in the whole world. So the message that they share is important. And the more we work together and the more of our identity comes back, the world is going to be a safer place. Environmentally, we'll be able to save the world with our ceremonies. So believing in ourselves that we are going to take our rightful place in society and contribute in a good way. So that's what we're going to do. Something tangible, something powerful, spiritual, believing that our spirituality is strong and good. It's a powerful thing. I have a lot of faith now because just this conversation in the work that I do, I've had to keep quiet and almost keep secrets and even take some of this information to the grave. But I don't feel that I have to do that because now I have you to share this with. It just makes me feel better that I don't have to do it alone anymore. And that's been key to me. That's what woke me back up, made me strong, made my voice strong, and allowed me to think about what I'm going to say to you in a good way. So Xaadas, thank you.
April?
This is a difficult question for me to answer because I have a hard time, having done repatriations under NAGPRA, I have a hard time thinking outside of the NAGPRA box, despite my many critiques of the process. I would love to see the Native communities that are working on repatriation have more support, have more resources. And I would like to see the repatriation efforts speed up. We still in our region have a whole list and we're trying to prioritize lists because we don't have enough people and enough resources to go after every known case of human remains at an institution. There needs to be improved communication. We think we have a complete list of all the known Alutiiq human remains and institutions around the country, and then each year we find out about a new situation, a new case. And we don't know if the lack of information in the past is because of organizations intentionally holding on to this information, or if it's because they just slowly realized in the many years since the passage of NAGPRA that they do have something from our region. But I think the whole process just needs more support, more human capacity. I wish I had something that was a little bit more direct and fully formed, but I think, you know, from the top of my head, those are the things that I would like to see to make it an easier process for the Native community, and so that we can have a beautiful reburial for those ancestors. Some tribes in our area don't have their own land, and so they are using the city cemetery. I think that collaboration between the tribes and the Native corporations should be encouraged, because our Native corporations do have land that can be used for that purpose of reinterment of those ancestors. But I wish I just wish I had something better to say, but it's just a lot of little things the whole way around that need to improve. Koyana.
Thank you, April. Sdaahl.
I feel like I'm feeling like the same kind of feeling as April. Like, oh, what would it be like if we could dream? So what I would dream would make things better for the repatriation process would be, first of all, the communities, our Indigenous communities, having stronger repatriation organizations, staff, committees, whatever resources that the communities need, that they're strong and healthy and can do the work, have the finances to do the work. We've all probably been there when it's so much of it is done kind of off the corner of our desks or volunteer. And it's really time for our Indigenous knowledge keepers to be paid for their knowledge. I would love to see more agreements, MOUs, I guess, between Indigenous communities and museums, and it is something that we are slowly working on. Agreements between the Haida and certain museums. And it would be amazing to have these agreements as we're becoming stronger watchmen, to be keeping an eye on our Haida belongings and our ancestral remains, and holding the museums accountable. Just so disturbing, to hear about, these big blockbuster exhibits, and they forgot to talk to us about those Haida pieces that they were putting on display, that we're getting cut out of any kind of connection to them, but they're being shown like these trophies on display, and they're bringing in so much money based on our belongings that we did not agree to put on display. In these agreements, I would love to see that these agreements are acknowledging that the museums are just the places to store them for now, that the ownership lies with us as Indigenous people. I would love to see in these kinds of agreements that the care and handling of the belongings and our ancestors' remains are addressed, that that we are holding museums accountable and saying, no, you will not be doing any studies on our ancestors, you will not be doing anything to them, about them, for them, without us saying that that is okay. And for museums and governments and churches to be paying for, to contribute to the payment of repatriation and the facilities for us to bring our belongings home to. And I would just love that the laws and policies that are created would include the tangible and intangible resources being repatriated. So I think, as you may know, museums hold a lot of language resources, and those are really important. And all the old journals and all the old notes, all those intangibles that we need to keep our languages and our cultural knowledge alive. Those need to be acknowledged and a part of repatriation from all museums and institutions. Okay, Hawa, thank you.
How, hopefully our crew watching, our participants were taking studious notes, because I know I was. My hand was flying through your recommendations, and I love that at the root of everything that you're all talking about, that it's human decency. Treat us as human beings, and then of course the resources that are necessary to make these things happen. And I love the thought process that April and Sdaahl, that both of you raised about how much money has been made in these museums to display our belongings, to display our ancestors for public eye and for the public to view. But when it comes to returning our sacred relatives, that all of a sudden the pockets are dry. And so I love that you both brought that into the space. Something to always consider. So we have, I'm going to turn it over to Lagunai, and I think we might have time for Machini's for Awa's question.
Yeah, I was just reading her question here, and I think any of you can answer this if you have a response to it, but if you don't, that's fine as well. The question's coming from my Awa, my mother, who is also Sdaahl, and she is asking if there are any plans to have the governments and institutions help build buildings to hold repatriated items. And are there ways we can put those belongings to rest if needed? So if any of you have any insight or thoughts on that, can just jump right in.
Well, I can share that. I think that's a wonderful idea. I have not seen any sort of funding made available for something like that. But with the Alutiiq Museum, we're currently in the process of fundraising to expand our facility to double or triple the size of our collections so that we can hold cultural objects that have been returned home. Of course, we're not interested in holding on to human remains. In the case of funerary objects, in the past, we have worked with the tribe in question to let them decide if they would like to have those funerary objects held in our sacred area, or if they feel that they should be reburied, reinterred along with the ancestral remains. And it has gone both ways. We do have a couple of sacred objects that did come from burials that the tribe did not want to take possession of, that they asked us to hold but to not display. And then in other cases, they have also requested that those objects be reburied along with the ancestors. But as history marches forward and we see some changes with the objects of cultural patrimony, and objects in private collections being redonated back to the home community, we do have a need for increased climate controlled storage to make sure that these objects are properly cared for. And so, I'll be thinking about that idea and seeing if there might be a way to secure repatriation related funding that could be used towards facility construction. Because as we all know, it's not cheap to take care of these objects. It's not cheap to store these objects. They deserve a high level of respect and care. And so that is what we're hoping to be able to do with our museum facility here locally.
This is kind of a two-edged sword once you think about it. A number of years ago, when the law was still new, we put in some repatriation claims. And we got a response back from one of the museums that stated, we can't send this object back to you unless you have a facility that can properly house that object. There is no stipulation or burden on the community to do that. There's no requirement to build a facility. If the object belongs to that clan or family, it should be returned to them. And the museum can't stipulate for a proper housing or museum. They can't. Only we can decide that. And so in many ways, what's that word? Decolonize? Or even deal with cultural appropriation and empower ourselves to do the correct thing and own the objects and do what we have to do to protect them. But the other institutions don't have that authority to impose that on us. I fully support our own museums and housing these objects. And I support that. The funerary objects and the remains are very sensitive to us. So requires training and apprenticeships to train our own people how to take care of them. We're very fortunate. We have tribal anthropologists that work for tribal governments. They seem to be a different mindset of what they were 20 years ago. So we're acclimating ourselves to work through this. And now we have cultural centers, and some museums are starting to work with us to build our own facility. It takes a lot of planning to do. I'm very impressed with the Maka people, what they've done with their ancestors, and their cultural center is a good example for Alaska. we have a long ways to go. And at the same time, we're doing it. So I'm hoping that we could create partnerships in Alaska so that we can work with each other and have good partners to do the right thing. I'm starting to sound random, but I better stop now. Thank you.
Let me think. The questions were about funding. I know, and Auntie Della and I talked about it a fair bit while she was visiting, and it is a big issue that the government in Canada, there really is very limited money for building anything these days, and there is no designated pot of repatriation money for Canadian Indigenous folks at all. And what was my other thought? About the institutions putting restrictions on us when we repatriate. And I think I agree with Bob about the timing of things, and we are very patient people, aren't we? When we first, the first repatriation claim that we gave to the British Museum was in probably 1996 for one of our ancestors that he was a Aga, he was a medicine man, and he was buried with a nahin, chilkat robe, and all of his medicine man tools. And right away they didn't even want to talk to us, and then they started to ease up a little bit, and of course they've got laws that protect them from repatriating anything, and they're very concerned about the Elgin marbles, the Egyptian mummies, all of these other treasures that bring in the tourists, I guess. So they don't want to set precedent and give back our relative. And then as they kind of started to ease up a little bit and said maybe they could long-term loan him to us, but he wouldn't come back with his belongings. So we're being very patient with them right now. That's unacceptable to get him back on a loan, and that we would not be allowed to bury him, to not be allowed to put him in his final resting place with the belongings that he was placed with at his death. So we are very, very patient and diplomatic. We had to learn how to be diplomatic with museums, and remind them that we come out of friendship, but we are very determined. And I think that's what they're learning, what they've been learning about the Haida in this process, that we're not going to give up. We're just gonna wait you out a little longer. However, for the question, Auntie.
Yeah, goodness, geez, so much. I really think it's interesting because it actually built off of that last question Wathlag Gidak asked, which was around what would our repatriation system look like? And, for our tribes and for our governments, our nations, to craft and create their own repatriation processes and have institutions follow that. Is there a model of that already happening someplace in Indian country, in the United States or in Canada? Another thing that I was thinking about as you were sharing too, April, around the funding, the how to reverse the equation as it currently sits, right? Which is the museums get the bulk of money and do the least amount of repatriation. And the tribes don't get very much money and are working towards it and striving for and doing the most amount towards repatriation. How do you actually flip that so that the tribes, the communities, the nations have the ability to receive, to be the receiver of those funds, and then the museums have to partner with the tribes. And this is already happening in education funding. The Alaska Native Education Program funding, the ANUP funding, already has that model cooked into it. Previously, schools were able to apply for those federal funds, and they could say, well, we're using it for these Native programs, but then they pretty much just used it within their budget to cover everyone, because of course Native students are all over in their institutions. And through a great deal of advocacy, a lot of hard work was put in by specifically some of our Alaska Native folks around that funding going to the schools here, to reverse the way that it was working. So now, in order to get that funding, schools have to partner with a Native organization. And you know, if that's already possible in one area of federal funding, can it be made possible in another? I also was thinking about a conversation we had many years ago with the Office of Children's Services in kind of reformulating how a process could work. And this was just in the brainstorming. This was just in the dialogue session. This was just in the kind of the thought sharing around like what's possible. And, you know, an employee of the state's Office of Children's Services said, well, it would make sense that the percentage of our budget, because we're talking about, you know, the potential of compacting. Now that potential has changed into actual compacting for our tribal children with the state of Alaska. But the question in those early stages, and then the thought process of this employee at OCS was, well, it would seem to make sense that if 60% of our children in foster care are Alaska Native, then 60% of our budget should go to Alaska Native tribes in order to be able to keep their children at home and in their families and with their relatives. And it was just like this mind-blowing kind of moment for everyone to think about what to even have that thought in the first place, right? And though we haven't gotten to that amount yet for sure, and that hasn't happened yet, or may not, in terms of the funding, compacting has happened and resources are being redistributed in a different way. So there's possibilities there. And so when we think about what it's going to look like in the future, like Bob was saying, this is a vision question, right? When it was asked. But to think about how that can be shifted and changed moving forward from here. Identifying the challenges and the barriers and the real lived experience of systemic and institutional racism and the colonial process that has been at play and is still at play in practices really needs to be addressed, but it has to be addressed by the institutions. It can't just be on the shoulders of the Native people that are either their employees or are in their community. The institutions have to do the hard work, which is something that April brought up earlier in one of her comments. And all of you have talked about accountability of those institutions to the communities that they are serving, to the Native people whose ancestors they have in their care, to the spiritual care that is necessary, to the respect of our humanity, like Bob has said so eloquently. Everything you folks have touched on and shared today helps us understand where we are in time. And with our cohort of folks who are professionals within the museum field in Alaska, to have a chance to really start understanding what it means to be people who care for our ancestors and how to make that a more respectful process is really critical. And I cannot thank each of you enough. April, for taking so much time with us and for sharing your knowledge and your truth. And to Sdaahl for being with us and sharing about how these things have worked in Canada and not worked in Canada, because it helps us learn also through your eyes what the system that we have can be or should not be. So how and to Bob for always coming with so much heart and love for our people and for humanity, and for holding all of us accountable to being good to each other, and to make sure that these systems and institutions find a way to practice that as well is really important. So Kunashchish Hawa for you and for your stories that you shared today with us and your thoughts. You have enriched my thinking. You have rekindled some fires around holding these institutions accountable and finding ways to be supportive of the work that you all are doing. So thank you so much for that. It's a gift. It's a gift to be able to take your knowledge and your story and be inspired, put it to work, right? That's what we will want. We wanted to put it to work for our people. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, how I Logan, I couldn't have said it better. To thank you for joining us, and for those participants who are witnessing this. Hopefully you've been watching the chat, because there's some amazing resources that our guest speakers have been putting in there. The chat box, and Chootman has been putting in some resources that Bob had mentioned in his work. So hopefully you all take advantage of those, and once this is posted on YouTube, we can post those in the chat box as well, so that folks have that as well. And with that, we'll say Xaadas. Thank you so much, and we will see you. We'll see the participants on Thursday, and then we'll see the rest of you next week.
I think that's just the cohort, right, on Thursday? Yeah, just the cohort of museum professionals who are part of the series. And I think, Chootman, did you have an announcement you wanted to share?
Yeah, I wanted to encourage everyone to come back next Tuesday for our final webinar. And this final webinar will be on decolonizing museums. We'll get to hear from panelists on how museums can become safe and welcoming for Native people to visit and work in, and making space for honest conversation, creating inclusive and safe environments within museums.
Well, I'm going to choose Hawa, and hope you folks will join us for that next week, the final in this series. And then also, once again, to our precious guests who gave us so much of their time and their knowledge. Atling Chish Goyana Jahawa so much. And we'll see you folks again soon.
How Talang off Kelt Logum.
How Dangdi Koyada.
Dangdi Koyada Masin.